It's the greatest killer in history. It's not a medieval plague. It's not a world war. It's a virus. 8 decades ago, it appeared out of nowhere. 1 year later, it suddenly vanished. No one knows where it went. No one knows when it will return. And no one knows how to stop it. Every man, woman, and child on Earth is living under a cloud. The threat that a mass killer who once moved among us could suddenly come back. It can leapfrog continents in hours. It's invisible to the naked eye, and it still eludes its pursuers.
I think the greatest medical mystery left is that of the 1918-19 influenza epidemic. Because it happened once, there's no reason to believe that it couldn't happen again. And I don't know how to protect myself and my loved ones. I know how not to get AIDS. I know how not to get cholera. I know how not to get most of the most threatening diseases in the world, but I have no idea how not to get influenza because it's breath-borne. You get it by associating with human beings.
At the U.S. Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, the hunt goes on for this elusive killer. 8 decades after it struck, scientists are still baffled why it was so deadly.
The 1918 flu was probably the worst infectious disease pandemic in all history. It killed at least 20 million people and maybe 50 million people within about a year's time. But nothing is known about the virus that caused it.
Like the Ebola virus, which quickly killed thousands of people in Africa, the 1918 flu was swift. Like the AIDS virus, which is slowly killing millions around the world, the 1918 flu had no cure. What made the flu worse, it was easy to catch. Millions caught it.
More people died as a result of the flu epidemic than died in World War I. And that's not just Americans, that's the entire casualties.
It was the perfect virus, quick to spread, easy to catch, and impossible to stop. Unlike Ebola and AIDS, the 1918 flu no longer makes headlines. It's history, for now.
I can say with certainty that there will be another influenza pandemic, but I simply can't say when it will occur.
In the spring of 1918, the world was dying. In Europe, the Germans had fought the English and the French to a standstill. After 4 years, neither side had much to show but millions of casualties and a few square miles of mud. Now the stalemate was broken. On the Eastern Front, Russia had quit the war, freeing hundreds of thousands of Germans to fight in France. The United States, with its vast untapped manpower, had just joined the battle, but time was its worst enemy. The Germans planned to win the war before America could turn the tide. In the spring of 1918, America was still turning civilians into soldiers. Across the country, sleepy little towns exploded into barrack cities of 50,000. One of the largest was Camp Funston, erected outside Fort Riley, Kansas. Farm boys from isolated hamlets were suddenly rubbing shoulders with thousands of strangers.
The typical doughboy at Fort Riley was probably a farm boy from the Midwest, not terribly educated, generally healthy by standards as far as diet and exercise was concerned, intensely patriotic, religious for the most part, anxious to do their part.
What mattered most was training soldiers as fast as possible, before the war was lost. Everything else took a back seat.
The fact that there were people living in very close quarters, they were eating in common mess halls, and the sanitary conditions were not the same as they are today. It was a common practice in restaurants in those days for uneaten food off of a customer's plate to be put into a common stew pot, you know, and that was fixed up for soup for the next day. It was very easy for germs and contamination to spread.
On March 8, 1918, Private Albert Gitchell reported for sick call at Fort Riley. He was suffering from headache, backache, sore joints, sore throat, sniffles, cough, chills, and fever. It seemed he had a really bad cold.
This was not something that alarmed people right at the beginning, but within several days after that, they had discovered that 46 cases of this same type of infection had surfaced at the post.
Some of the first outbreaks were known in some of these military camps, probably because people were in such close quarters, and you're bringing together young men who often from very isolated rural places who don't have a lot of immune reactions to prior infections. So you have a very susceptible population, and so the viruses can, especially respiratory viruses, can spread very rapidly among recruits.
Some soldiers took to sick beds. Most fought through the illness and pushed on toward the front. As they crossed America, so did their mysterious disease. In April 1918, it reached Boston, Massachusetts, and entered the home of 3-year-old Frances Pearlstein.
Well, I remember waking up, getting up rather, and my tongue is sticking out. It was this thick. I couldn't talk at all. And till my mother heard me and came in, immediately called the doctor. So she made a very wonderful concoction with peroxide and lemon and I don't know, 5 or 6 different things. Everything she had in the house that was very strong, one stronger than the other. Every hour, I cannot tell you the torture that I went through with that, because it was so painful that I know it seemed like my ears and everything were on fire. And when the doctor came, he said, "Mrs. Pearlstein, you saved this girl's life."
Frances Pearlstein was lucky, luckier than the men at Fort Riley. 522 soldiers died before they ever got near a battlefield. By now, doctors knew what they were dealing with. Not the common cold, but influenza, the flu.
It's one of the most easily transmitted of all diseases. It's transmitted by breath, by aerosol. Except under the most extreme conditions, it will transmit. Under conditions you wouldn't believe, it somehow will still transmit. If people can get any place close to each other, they will manage to transfer the influenza virus.
It was an old familiar enemy. It came around every year, killed a few people, and moved on. In the spring of 1918, tens of thousands fell ill. Hundreds died. Doctors were mystified.
This particular strain of the disease tended to repress the respiratory functions, the heart rate and so forth and so on. And so that was kind of puzzling, apparently, to the doctors that saw it and encountered it at Fort Riley anyway.
Something always goes around every spring. What was different in the spring, there was an elevated death rate. Nothing spectacular, just more deaths to flu and pneumonia than usual in the spring. Of the small number of fatalities, a rather odd number of them were young adults. Young adults are not supposed to die of the flu. Young adults are supposed to be miserable for a week and then go back to work. But some of these people kept on going to the grave.
By the summer of 1918, the Allies were barely hanging on. After 4 years of fighting, England and France were bled white. The American commander, General John J. Pershing, said he needed 3 million recruits. Without them, the war would be lost. The Germans weren't waiting. On July 14th, they planned to launch the attack that would win the war. It would come too late. For the Allies, help arrived in the nick of time. In April 1918, a newly commissioned captain from Missouri named Harry Truman stepped off a troop ship into the port of Brest and set foot in France. Truman was just one of hundreds of thousands of reinforcements who passed through Brest that spring. The same month Harry Truman arrived in France, so did a deadly stowaway. The Americans were entering a new kind of war, waged with new kinds of weapons. Yet in the world's first modern war, soldiers fought in the most primitive conditions, the trenches.
They were wading through shit and piss, because what else was there to do with it? You certainly didn't crawl out of your trench to relieve yourself. You get your head blown off.
As Americans arrived in the trenches, so did their stowaway.
Of course, this was about the same time that the 89th Division was shipping out, heading to Europe. And so soldiers from Fort Riley undoubtedly took the flu bug back to Europe with them.
In the filth of the trenches, the virus quickly spread from the Americans to their French and English allies. When the Germans captured Allied soldiers, they unwittingly took the flu prisoner. By July, the flu had spread clear across Germany to Poland. It roamed beyond Europe to India and Asia. On the Western Front, the flu began to take its toll, but the deaths went unnoticed. The Germans had mounted their last great push. Hospitals and cemeteries were filled with the casualties of war. Next to them, what were a few deaths from flu? Then, as suddenly and mysteriously as the disease appeared, it vanished. Yet the flu hadn't ceased fighting. It was simply gathering strength for its next deadly attack. In August 1918, Assistant Navy Secretary Franklin Roosevelt made a tour of the battle lines in France. For the future president, all wasn't well on the Western Front. As he prepared to return home, he was running a fever of 102. On September 8th, Roosevelt boarded the Leviathan on the port of Brest. He collapsed in his cabin, racked by double pneumonia and influenza. The transport became a death ship. As it crossed the Atlantic, it left a wake of corpses. When the Leviathan docked in New York, Roosevelt was more dead than alive. An ambulance rushed him to his mother's home. It took him a month to recover. The flu Roosevelt contracted that summer was nothing like the one that devastated Fort Riley in the spring. It was a mutant virus unlike any the world had seen.
They're sort of designed to change themselves as rapidly as possible, presumably because it's advantageous to the virus to avoid being recognized by the immune system. And by random chance, a mutation could have occurred that would just make this virus a killer.
In the fall of 1918, the Allies launched a huge counterattack along the Western Front. The Germans fell back, fighting all the way. As the casualties mounted, the wounded went home to get well. Transports left Brest bound for America, Africa, Asia. The flu went with them.
Within a week or 10 days of each other, you had 3 explosions of the new influenza, the killing influenza, in Brest, France, in Freetown, Sierra Leone, on the coast of West Africa, and in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, the odds against getting a radically new virus in these 3 areas separated by thousands and thousands of miles of ocean, the odds are impossibly high.
Once more, the flu spread like wildfire. In Nigeria, half a dozen passengers managed to infect an entire city. Everywhere it struck, it was called a different name, but the one that stuck was Spanish flu.
Lots and lots of Spaniards got it, but no higher percentage than French or Germans or English. It's just that the Spanish were not in the war. They were not a belligerent, and therefore they didn't conceal it. Everybody else said, there's nothing wrong. Everything's fine. The Spanish said, we're all sick with the flu, so everybody called it the Spanish flu. It's a bad rap.
The new virus first struck America at Camp Devens, Massachusetts in Boston. Just 6 days after the first case was reported, 6,674 men were down with the flu. Within a day of infection, a man would be on his deathbed. In 2 days, he'd be in the grave. Devens was transformed into a death camp. No one knew what hit them.
Their pathology was that their lungs just filled with fluid or blood. And these people literally drowned. This was not a common pathology for other influenza outbreaks that have been seen since 1918.
One of the first signs was when the person was gone, it was when they started to turn blue because they wouldn't get any oxygen. And then at that point they would go on to purple, and a lot of them went on to just flat out black, which panicked some medical people because they thought they were dealing with the Black Death. They thought this, 14th century plague had returned.
One of the common theories was that this was really germ warfare, that this was something that the Germans had released. And there were reports in Boston of people reporting seeing a cloud of green smoke come out of a ship just before the Boston epidemic occurred, and that was the source of this virus.
Unable to combat this strange new disease, soldiers tried to hide from it.
One of the means that they resorted to try and curb the spread of the contamination was the use of the gauze face mask. In one afternoon, the women in the community gathered in the workrooms and made 1,700 of the gauze face masks to send out to the fort.
Viruses are incredibly tiny, and so certainly would not be stopped by a mask.
Men died faster than the grave diggers could dig. Coffins were stacked like cordwood. A letter from a doctor at Fort Devens to a friend describes the nightmare.
This epidemic started about 4 weeks ago and has developed so rapidly that the camp is demoralized. These men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of influenza, and when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible. We have been averaging about 100 deaths per day. There is no doubt in my mind that there is a new mixed infection here, but what, I don't know. Goodbye, old pal. God be with you till we meet again.
The fall epidemic moved like a whirlwind. By late September, it had spread across the country to the very site of the spring outbreak, Camp Funston. It was devastating.
On September 26th, there was one case reported. 6 days later, 1,100 cases. And by the middle of October, there were 12,000 people sick at Camp Funston with the flu. It came so quickly and so swiftly, and they were just so completely overrun with it that they soon had to convert barracks literally into sick rooms.
The virus overran the body itself. Within hours of infection, fatal dark blotches broke out on the cheeks, then spread to the ears. Soon the entire face turned black. If a soldier's feet were already black when he entered the hospital, he was given up for dead.
Another very interesting and unusual feature of the 1918 flu is that the people who were most susceptible to die were healthy adults. 20 to 40-year-olds had really significant mortality from the 1918 flu, but adults tend to not die from the effects of influenza. They may get sick from influenza, but they tend not to die. But there was a significant mortality of 20 to 40-year-olds in 1918 that was also extremely unusual, and there's really no good explanation for that.
The mutant virus struck when medicine was still in adolescence. Typhoid fever was a killer without a cure. No one had yet found a vaccine for measles. Polio crippled 20,000 Americans every year, including the future president who managed to survive the flu. The flu remained a mystery too.
The reason that nothing could be done is no antibiotics were known at the time, so it was a lot of hand-holding that physicians could do. The aspirin was known to exist, so they did give aspirin to people to try to keep their fevers down, but that was really all they could do.
For America's doughboys, germs would prove deadlier than Germans. Almost 49,000 would die on the battlefield. but more than 62,000 would die of the flu. In the middle of the worst war yet known to mankind, civilians far from the trenches felt safe. But a killer, more devastating than bullets or bombs, was about to creep into their homes. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, all was suddenly quiet on the Western Front. The war was over. After 4 years of bloodshed, more than 9 million men lay dead. But as peace broke out, so did a killing spree far worse than the war. Christmas 1918 was only a few weeks away, and hundreds of thousands of doughboys yearned to go home. Captain Harry Truman was as anxious as the rest. He had just learned his cousin had come down with the deadly Spanish flu. And his sister. And the girl he had vowed to marry. Truman wasn't the only soldier to get dire news.
Every day, nearly someone of my outfit will hear that his mother, sister, or sweetheart is dead. It's heartbreaking almost to think that we are so safe and so well over here, and that the ones we'd like to protect more than all the world have been more exposed to death than we. Harry Truman.
The virus that followed wounded soldiers home had broken out of the Army hospitals. Now it began to wreak havoc across America. The United States suffered the brunt of the flu in October and November.
So from Boston to San Francisco, within that 2-month period, everyone in the United States was basically exposed to it, and a significant number of people got ill. About a third of the population of the United States caught the flu at about the same time, within a couple months of one another. So you can imagine what a devastating thing that was. There was no way that the medical resources of the United States could deal with a third of the population being ill at the same time.
My mother developed flu and double pneumonia, and my brother was also ill. And my father rented an apartment across the street and had us stay there with my grandmother. We may have been in that apartment and separated 3 to 4 weeks.
There's no place you could run. There's no place you get away from it. And the fears of the people were terrible. And because sometimes, some of them died in a day.
My younger brother got very, very ill. He was 16 at the time, and he was running a very high fever and became delirious. So they decided to send him to the hospital, the doctors decided. And I have a vivid picture. And when I walked out of the back door of the store, I saw them carrying my brother down on a stretcher, and he was just raving. And then when they told me that he died, I was just devastated. And at the time, before he got ill, he was making a model airplane. And after he died, my father took that airplane and just broke it up in pieces like his heart was broken.
The flu raised hopes, then dashed them to pieces, as it did when Sam Weiser's wife fell ill.
We didn't think it was going to happen that quick. We thought, as a matter of fact, that she maybe helped because she coughed up a lot of that phlegm that she had in her lungs. She passed away very suddenly, in the middle of the night.
I think you felt that sudden things could happen, that your mortality was something that you never knew when your number was up. Whether you were a child or grown up, you just never knew.
My mother cried a lot, plenty of tears. Her heart was sore, broken. To raise a boy to be 16 years old and lose him, it's very difficult to take.
Gilda Perry is still haunted by the memory of her sister's bout with the flu.
I do remember a doctor coming to the home, and I do remember they had her in the bedroom, and in those days they didn't have anything to counteract it. And so I remember he used iodine on a piece of cotton to swab her throat. And I remember the screams were just terrible. You'll never forget that. I hid myself in the closet because it was so horrible.
Doctors had nothing to prescribe. Out of desperation, families ventured into their gardens and concocted every home remedy they could dream up.
Mother would put bags of, a little bag, she would soak a little bag and put some garlic in it to ward off the disease. And then in those days, if you got sick, they got goose grease. And they would rub your chest with it. It's supposed to warm your chest.
Everybody had a remedy, everything from drinking a shot of whiskey a day to gargling with salt water.
They tried everything imaginable. My favorite one is tying a red ribbon around your left biceps.
The flu couldn't have struck at a worse time. 1/3 of America's doctors had gone to Europe with the Army. Those on the home front were swamped.
And healthcare professionals, doctors and nurses, were particularly susceptible to being infected because they were dealing with sick people.
They worked 24-hour shifts, had a few hours sleep, and then went back to the duty. As a result, they were often weakened and fatigued.
Good physicians and nurses are supposed to keep cranking along, and they did. But nurses may have even had a higher death rate than doctors. Doctors, so to speak, could stand to one side and say, yes, that person is sick. But nurses had to slop around in their fluids, and so they had a very high death rate.
In the fall of 1918, 21-year-old Amelia Earhart was working as a nurse in Canada when her own health took a turn for the worse.
Working 12 to 14 hours at a stretch made me a more than normally easy prey for influenza. Altogether, I have been more than 2 months sick and face the awful prospect of doing nothing for 2 more. Said outlook, looking more desperate while I search vainly for any improvement.
America suddenly had a new kind of war hero. The thousands of volunteers who set aside their fears and stepped forward to nurse the sick and the dying. But the dying went on. The incurable disease also proved unpredictable. In 1 week, 5,000 people died in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, at opposite ends of Pennsylvania. Yet in Connecticut, the flu's path was erratic. More than 700 perished in Waterbury. 20 miles away, Milford was untouched.
It really is a mystery. Some cities had 3 waves of it. Some cities didn't have much at all. The virus would differ slightly from one area to another, very, very slightly.
The flu rolled across America unopposed. States weren't yet required to file death statistics with Washington, so Washington was in the dark. Even after Congress realized an epidemic was sweeping the nation, it did nothing. The Surgeon General decided that trying to quarantine a nation of city dwellers would be futile. President Wilson was preoccupied with the outbreak of peace, not the outbreak of the flu.
The people in authority, medically and politically, the middle-aged, had never lived through anything like this. And even when the statistics arrived from the first hit cities, they probably just looked at them and said, and then gone on to the next page.
Ordinary citizens took matters in their own hands. They bullied mayors and doctors to do something, anything. Things
got pretty silly because the public pressure, the public demand that something be done was so enormous that they stampeded the politicians and the doctors and the nurses into doing things that were worthless, were absolutely worthless, and conceivably worse than worthless. The medical profession ran out and started coming up with vaccines, and many, many, many thousands of people all the way across the country were vaccinated with God only knows what. We took mucus excretions from people recovering from the disease and sort of ran them through cheesecloth and inoculated people with them. Most of these vaccines probably didn't make any difference at all beyond a sore arm, but some of them were probably not at all helpful. They may have even infected people with something else. You don't want anybody else's body fluids. You don't know what that other person has got.
San Francisco passed a law ordering citizens to cover their faces. So did Seattle. It didn't help. In some cities, the death toll grew so high, streetcars were converted to hearses. In Philadelphia, the city morgue was so jammed with corpses, the staff finally had to open the doors just to breathe. Across America, people went into hiding. Restaurants stopped serving. Theaters canceled shows. Churches lost congregations. Entire cities shut down. Schools, just back in session, once more closed their doors. Across the country, playgrounds fell silent. All that remained was the ghostly echo of a popular children's rhyme.
I once had a bird and its name was Inza. I opened the window and in flew Inza.
Throughout the fall of 1918, the flu crisscrossed America, and the death toll mounted. In September, 10,000. In October, almost 200,000. By year's end, more than 300,000 had perished in the terrible fall epidemic. For every person who died of the flu, 50 more struggled through it. Then, just like the spring virus, the fall virus quietly and mysteriously vanished. It seemed the world had heard the last of this killer, but it would strike one more time and change the course of history. In the spring of 1919, the victors of the World War gathered in Paris to write a peace treaty. President Woodrow Wilson, leader of the nation that turned the tide, was basking in the glow of victory. Yet, Wilson had once tasted defeat. Growing up in Virginia after the Civil War, he knew how it felt to live in a conquered land. Following Abraham Lincoln's example, Wilson urged a charitable peace. Not his allies. Licking their wounds and burning for revenge, England, France, and Italy pushed for a harsh treaty to punish Germany. The peace conference turned into a battle, then a stalemate. Wilson was threatening to return to Washington without a treaty when fate intervened.
On the 3rd of April, Wilson became extremely ill. His physician thought that he was going to die. It scared the hell out of his physician.
The flu was back. A third and minor wave struck that spring, but its repercussions were tremendous. Wilson survived, but so weakened he lost his will to fight. He signed a harsher peace treaty than he wished for. Germany would come to resent the Treaty of Versailles, and an obscure corporal would exploit it in his rise to power. As dictator of Germany, he would launch a second world war more terrible than the first. The flu benefited no one but Adolf Hitler. In American history, the Great Flu Epidemic remains a killer without precedent.
All in all, the flu killed 500,000 Americans in a 10-month period. And there's never been any kind of a war or calamity or natural disaster that's had that same kind of effect.
In Great Britain, 150,000 people died of the flu. In a single week, it killed more Londoners than all the German air raids of World War I. India suffered more than any country. In just 3 months, at least 12.5 million people died of the flu, perhaps millions more. Some towns ran out of coffins and buried victims in mass graves. The only place on Earth left unscathed was remote American Samoa. World War I proved the worst war yet fought. 9 million soldiers perished, along with 5 million civilians. But in the field of killing, man still ran a distant second to Mother Nature. No one knows just how many died in the Great Flu Epidemic. At least 30 million. Some say 50 million. Whatever the toll, it killed more people in less time than any scourge in history, including the Second World War. In 1919, peace returned, the flu went away, and the world got back to its feet. Those who survived the Great Epidemic feared its return, but it didn't come. More than half a century went by. Then, it seemed history might repeat itself. In February 1976, a healthy young soldier at Fort Dix, New Jersey, suddenly died. The coroner's verdict? Influenza. Scientists worried the 1918 flu was back. On March 24th, President Gerald Ford launched a nationwide program of vaccinations against what was dubbed swine flu. Months later, the vaccinations were halted after a handful of Americans died from the flu shots. The flu scare turned out to be a false alarm, and the country heaved a sigh of relief. Should the 1918 flu ever really come back, the world remains defenseless against it. At the U.S. Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, doctors have outsmarted some of the worst killers on Earth. But the 1918 flu has left them baffled. They have at their fingertips the most sophisticated technology for developing a vaccine, but they're missing a crucial ingredient: a piece of the virus. Government scientists handled the case like detectives tracking a fugitive. The search for clues led to an Army warehouse outside Washington, D.C. It holds more than 3 million tissue samples from soldiers autopsied as far back as the Civil War. The samples were preserved in wax, sealed in boxes, and forgotten. In 1995, researchers scoured the warehouse's vast card catalog for the record of any serviceman who died in the 1918 flu epidemic. What they found held the key to cracking one of the world's greatest medical mysteries. This is the tomb of an unknown soldier. It contains a tissue sample from a 21-year-old Army private stationed at Fort Jackson, South Carolina during World War I.
He had a very short clinical course. He presented to the camp hospital on September 20th, 1918 at 11 o'clock at night with high fever, fever of 103, and chills, cough, and chest pain, and was given a diagnosis of influenza pneumonia, and had a very rapid downhill course. He died of massive pneumonia, and that's really all we know about him.
A sliver of flesh encased in wax is prepped. Under the microscope, medical detectives can pick up the cold trail of a killer. The killer was the 1918 flu, and these are its fingerprints: the virus. There's just one problem. Even under the most powerful electron microscope, the virus is too dense to see in detail. The scientists must break it into small pieces of RNA, one of the virus's genetic building blocks.
We would make multiple copies of these very small pieces and then figure out the genetic code of that piece, and then go back and look at other pieces and eventually assemble them like putting together a puzzle to try to get the full-length sequence of the virus. And we have about maybe not quite 10% of the gene sequence of the virus known. We just have the first pictures of what the virus is going to look like.
Once the team has a complete genetic picture of the virus, they can develop a vaccine. But that may take years. Medicine has come a long way since 1918. We've wiped out smallpox. We're fighting cancer. We're treating AIDS. Yet, for all our advances, we're no better equipped than our grandparents to fight the next deadly outbreak of the flu.
If anything has to do with science, we think we've got it made. Technology and science will fix it all. The 1918 flu proves that it won't fix it all. Even if it came back today, we'd have antibiotics to control the bacterial secondary infections, but we don't have anything to cure influenza.
Where the flu virus is hiding, no one knows. If it ever breaks out, we'll be in greater peril than our ancestors were. The world is a closer place than it was in 1918. A virus like the flu is only a plane ride away from anywhere on Earth. A simple handshake or hello could prove fatal. As science scrambles to catch a killer, the world waits to see who will win the race. The vaccine or the virus?